So this is the same information as the first video, just with sound this time. So this is Chapter 8 Guided Notes, Section 8.1 and 8.3. Just the basics of graphing. This should be a review or a refresher for you. For the Chapter 8 notes, you're going to want a ruler. Not necessarily a full-size ruler, just a 6-inch ruler will do. Your pencil, of course. You also might want colored pencils for this video. It's a little bit easier to see the graphs with colored pencils. And then finally, always have your calculator handy for any computation that you might need. So the first part of notes is just a review on the rectangular coordinate grid. I know this is already all worked out from the previous video. So just a review of how to plot points. These are called coordinate points. Co means together. Ordinate is like an ordered pair. They're also called ordered pairs. You always have X first and then Y. So the breakdown of the grid, you've got your x-axis, you've got your y-axis, you've got your origin in the middle. And then we just went through and practiced plotting points. 4, 7 would be 4 to the right and 7 up. That's where point A is. Negative 4, 7 would be 4 to the left and then 7 up. So to the right is positive, to the left is negative. Up is positive and down is negative. So point B is at negative 4, positive 7. Point C is at positive 4, negative 7. And finally point D is at negative 4, negative 7. And we use capital letters to label individual ordered pairs. The grid is broken up into 4 quadrants. Quadrant 1 is the top right quadrant. It's often referred to as the positive quadrant. The top left corner is called quadrant 2 or Q2. Notice it's Roman numerals for your quadrants. Quadrant 2 is your negative positive quadrant. Your X values are negative. Your Y values are positive. Quadrant 3 is the bottom left corner, the negative quadrant. And finally quadrant 4, Roman numeral 4, is the bottom right corner, and that's positive in the X, negative in the Y. The first value in an ordered pair is always X, and the second value is always Y. So point A is in quadrant 1 or Q1, point B is in quadrant 2, point C is in quadrant 4, and point D is in quadrant 3. Then we plotted 4 more points with zeros involved this time. Anytime you have 0 for the X coordinate, that means you do not move right or left. Anytime you have 0 for a Y coordinate, you do not move up or down. So point E is 0, 5, 0 right and left, straight up 5. It's not in quadrant 1 or quadrant 2. It's on the Y-axis. Point F is negative 5, 0. So we go left 5, 0 up and down, and that is on the X-axis. Point G is 0, negative 5, so 0 in the X direction, negative 5 in the Y direction, so we go down 5 on the Y-axis. And finally point H, 5, 0. You go 5 to the right, 0 up and down, and it ends up on the X-axis. So just being familiar with the coordinate grid, refreshing your memory on that, how to plot points, where the origin is, what's positive, what's negative, and the name of the quadrants. To help you remember the order of the quadrants, because it is kind of funky, if you draw a capital letter C all the way across your grid, it kind of shows you the order of the quadrants, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that can help you remember those quadrants. After that, we kind of stepped off of the grid and just looked at some linear equations. So the bottom half of that page, we're just working out some linear equations. If you're given a linear equation, notice there's an X and a Y in the equation. That's what makes it a linear equation. So I'm going to plug in negative 3 for X, and I'm going to see what I get for Y. So if you look at my work here in the previous video, you'll see that I plugged in negative 3 for X. I worked it out, and it worked out to negative 5, not 27. And so this ordered pair negative 327 is not a solution for this specific equation. I did the same thing with this other ordered pair, 0, 4. I plugged in 0 for x. I worked it out to see if I get 4. And sure enough, I did get y equals 4, so that is a true ordered pair, good solution for this equation. Same idea on example 2. I plugged in 2 for x, and I plugged in negative 6 for y. Be careful here, you've got subtraction, which was part of the equation, and you've got a negative, which came from the ordered pair. So when you subtract a negative, it becomes addition. So this becomes 6 plus 6, and that's why that equation, that ordered pair rather, was true for that equation. And last but not least here, we've got 1 for x and 9 for y. If I plug all that in, over here I get negative 6, which does not equal 12. We're saying that it should equal 12, and it does not. In your homework, you'll have 2 or 3 of these to work out. They're not always one yes and one no. There could be multiple yeses. There could be multiple no's. So there's an unlimited set of points that work, and there's an unlimited set of points that do not work. So it's just up to the specific pair. They might all work, they might not all work. It just all depends on the problem. You have to plug them in every time. The next part of this introduction was just practicing graphing. So if you're given a linear equation and you're asked to fill in a table of values, given some x values, fill in the y values. From there, you'll plot those points on your grid, and it should make a straight line, which is why these are called linear equations. So here, this work gets a little messy. I plugged in negative 1 for x. I solved algebraically for y like we did in chapter 2, and I got negative 9. So that's where the negative 9 here came from. Then I did the same thing with 0. I plugged in 0 for x, worked out the algebra, and got negative 6 for y. I was out of room here, so you can always have an extra sheet of paper. I'm not sure where to put mine. Here it is. If you need some more space. Again, I plugged in 2 for x here, worked it out and got 0 for y. And then I plugged in, what's the last one? 3. Plugged in 3 for x here, worked out the algebra and got 3 for y. One thing I was showing in the first video is this little symbol that I use. It's the symbol for what we call the section, like the textbook section. It's 2 letter S's hooked together, so if you want to draw it yourself, it's 2 letter S's hooked together. Again, let me see if you can see that 2 letter S's kind of hooked together. It's Latin or Greek. It's just something I picked up in college, so you'll see me draw that. I don't think it's in the textbook, but if you were ever taking extra notes, you'll see that little symbol for section. So from there, I plotted these 4 points. I plotted negative 1, 9 right there. I plotted 0, negative 6 right here. I plotted 2, 0, and I plotted 3, 3. If you did this correctly, they should all line up against your ruler and make a straight line. If one of your points is off, if they're all over the place, the first thing to do is to check your algebra, make sure you solved correctly. The next thing to do is make sure you plotted your ordered pairs correctly onto the grid. Oftentimes students mess that up. They'll miss a negative or go in the wrong direction. But your points, however many you have, should make a straight line, because these are all linear equations. So we did the same thing for example 4. I took each one of the x values. I plugged in negative 3. I worked it out to get 9. I plugged in 0. Worked it out to get 3. And I plugged in 3. Worked it out to get negative 3. So it takes a little bit of algebra to plug in your x values. One thing I want to discuss that did not get recorded in the first video is picking x values. If the homework rather does not give you x values, you want to keep your numbers small. You want to pick at least one negative number, 0, and one positive number. That way you kind of have a spread across the grid. Don't pick big numbers. Keep them small, I would say less than 5, so anything between -5 and +5. 0 is always a good number to pick. It gives you a good, nice whole number. You should always get integers or whole numbers here. You don't want fractions and decimals because it makes it too hard to plot. So once you have 3 good points, we're going to plot those: -3, 9, 0, 3, and 3, -3. And again, if you did this correctly, they should all line up against your ruler. You trace it all the way across. Your grid lines go on forever, so you have arrows up and down to represent that infinite distance. And then the last one here is a fraction. Students usually panic. When you see a fraction, look at the denominator and pick values that divide by the denominator. So nice numbers that divide cleanly by the denominator. So I picked -6 because that divides nicely by 3. I picked 0 because 0 is always good to pick. And I picked 9 because 9 divides nicely by 3. So you will fill in each one. If you're not comfortable with fractions or you just don't trust yourself with fractions, let your calculator do your work. You can type in 1 divided by 3 parentheses -6. You should get -2. One thing I pointed out in the video was the difference between the negative button and the subtraction button. And so if I were to type in 1 divided by 3 and then type in -6 instead of -6, you'll notice in the calculator the negative's a little bit smaller and the minus is bigger. That's going to give me an error because it's trying to subtract from nothing. So it doesn't like you to use the subtraction symbol when you mean negative. So make sure you know the difference between those two. So again, you can let your calculator do this work for you. 1/3 parentheses 9 can help you out if you're just not as comfortable with fractions. But you get your points. You plot those points. So -6, -2, 0, 0 in the middle, 9, 3, and if you did it correctly, it should line up. Make a nice straight line across your grid. So that's just the audio to go with the work from the previous video.